Good afternoon to everyone. Hearty welcome to all those who are joining us on this Ebenezer platform this afternoon as we worship and as we enter once again into a study of God's Word. I do hope that you have had a really good day today. Certainly the weather was fine, and I hope that would allow you to do a number of chores that otherwise you would not have been able to do when we had the rains. But we give God thanks for all things, and it is certainly good that we can come together again to worship and to study the Word of God. I want to invite us now to bow our heads as we offer up a word of prayer as we begin our meeting. Let us pray. Of God and our Father, we give you thanks, we give you praise, we honor and glorify your name. We are grateful that the days pass and that we are able to come together as your children to both worship you and to meditate upon your word. We thank you for the blessings of the day, the food on our tables, the roof over our head, the clothes on our backs, our family, friends, and dear loved ones. We want to pray, dear Lord, that as we enter upon these solemn times in which we are living, that the word of God will continue to fortify our minds with the truth, and that we will grow and be strengthened so that as we meet the challenges of the days ahead, we will not falter, but that we will press on cheerily, and that at the end of all things, we can receive the just reward that Jesus has promised to all those who are faithful. May we all truly be faithful. May we and see Jesus and be with him forevermore. It's our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. This evening, brethren, we want to study a very special chapter. Well, all chapters are special, really. But our focus this evening will be on the man Moses. And as such, we are going to share our study tonight on the second chapter of Exodus. I must say that I had a little discourse of Brother Paul during the course of the day, who indeed influenced the decision to study this particular chapter, and certainly from some things that he would have drawn from it, I'm sure that we would find very enthralling and very enjoyable as we look at the life of Moses, that great man of God who, in my opinion, is one of the, well, to me, the greatest leader ever to be found anywhere upon planet Earth for the time that this world was in existence. That's my opinion, and I do believe that I have a reason to believe that that is true. We want to therefore look at his life, look at what God, the mission that God has set up for him, and all the implications of that mission, and what we can draw from it for ourselves as a church, as individuals. Because I'm sure that Moses, the man, has so much to his life, to his character, to the kind of person that he was, that there's certainly a lot that we can learn from. So I pray that we have a wonderful and a blessed discussion this afternoon. But before we do that, let me just turn to Acts chapter 7, verse 20, and just read one verse there as we go into our discussion for this afternoon. Acts chapter 7, verse 20. And we are right. And so it says, at this time, Moses was born and was well pleasing to God. And he was brought up in his father's house for 3 months. Verse 21 goes on to say, but when he was set out, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and brought him up as her own son. And Moses, verse 22 says, and Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and in deed. The King James Version describes Moses as beautiful. And I thought that was an interesting word. I would normally think that that word, when describing anybody, would be attributed more to women. But here Moses is being described as beautiful. But I'm sure that has a lot of implications in terms of the man's character, in terms of the fact that he was a man chosen by God for a particular purpose. And therefore, as we enter into our discussion, we want to draw those salient points that certainly can be of help to us to very well imitate the man himself, and at the same time see where in our own lives, where God might very well be calling us to some particular mission, as in case of Moses. So I want to ask Paul to introduce the subject because, as I said, he was very influential in us discussing this topic. So I will give Paul the opportunity to say a few words and then lead on to the discussion. Paul?
Thank you very much, Brother Jordan, and welcome and good night to everybody. Thanks for having me in this. So this discussion would have been had with not really young people of our church and others actually about two to 3 weeks ago, and it was a very robust discussion. And the aim is to we will look at the beginning sessions, these given parts of Moses' life. But we really want to focus on that 40-year period in Midian and ask some questions. And the truth is that it has the period of waiting, I call it. And the truth is, it might have some. It might be a blessing to those of us who are older than young people. Although it blessed them as well. There's some things coming out here that I find very interesting. That those of us who are aging and over a certain age, it can be interesting to us. So, without any further ado, I didn't have a chance to mock up any slides per se for this evening. So, I'm going to encourage you to look in your Bibles, look online as well. I usually use a website called BibleGateway.com. I find that to be honestly a very beautiful website, and an app. If you have a phone, you can download the app on your phone. What I like it is that it gives you access to a whole set of Bible translations. You have the Amplified version, the New King James version, the English Standard version, the New Century version, all these types of different things for free. And you can compare all of them. If you don't understand from one, the King James version is a bit too complex or not too, it's written in Old English, you can actually get it in a easier to understand translation, the New Century version, New Living Translation, Amplified version, and so forth. So I want to start out by saying that the story of Moses in the book of Exodus is really interesting. And the reason why we're going to look at it from two different books. So we're going to look at it in Exodus. We're going to look at it as Brother Jordan started to read in Acts as well, because Stephen, who was a deacon in the early church, he, in his discourse to his fellow men, would have recounted the life of Moses. And there's some points that came out from Stephen's discourse that you don't necessarily find in Exodus, but of course Stephen would know because of Jewish tradition and the history that came down. So we're going to balance both the two of those to see what we can find out and learn a bit more about Moses. But I want to start at the beginning. I want to give us some context of the time that Moses lived in, right? So we're going to start with Exodus chapter 1. Exodus chapter 1, we're going to look for it in your Bibles. Exodus chapter 1. I'll read this first part to give us, but as we go forward, I'm going to ask somebody else. I see Harry, I see Shara, I see Brother Devnish, Alfred, I see Lolita, I see Charles Clark. I want to ask you to read from your Bibles. If you want to pull up the Bible on my screen, I can try to do so. Read. You can feel free to read from yours. I'm going to start out with Exodus chapter 1, and we're going to be reading from verse 8 and onward to get a context. So some history behind this whole thing, how Moses came about. We know that Joseph, when in the Bible, we leave Joseph. He spent some time in Egypt as a slave, and then he became a governor, and he brought his family over. And at this point, some time had passed since Joseph. And Exodus 1 verses 8, chapter 1 verses 8 starts by saying, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And it happened in the event of war that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. Now, when I did some research, the reality is that when we look at history, Egypt has always been this very mighty and very prolific type of land. The truth is the chances of the Israelites outnumbering the Egyptians, truthfully, may have been nil, not as much, but even see this even in this time of war with Russia and Ukraine and stuff like that. Sometimes people can exaggerate concepts if they want to drive an agenda, right? But so here we see that the Pharaoh is saying that we feel that they will get more than us, and we often hear this from persons from countries who want to don't want to take in refugees, and so forth. We saw it happen in America some years back. And then it also says that basically lest they also side with our enemies, and form something against us, team up and fight. Because as is said in popular parlance, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So he's basically to stop them from rising up, he wanted to subject them. And verses 12 to 14 talks about the fact that they basically the Egyptians would have the leadership would have afflicted the Israelites. But the more, verse 12 says, the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And there was dread in the children of Israel. Verse 30 says, the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor. They made their lives bitter with hard bondage and martyr and break in all manner of service in the field. All their service in which they made them serve was with rigor. And the king of Egypt spoke the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stools, if it is a boy, then you shall kill them. If it's a daughter, she shall live. And the reality is, some people surmise that Pharaoh not only wanted to reduce the amount of Israelites in Egypt. This was a mode to basically kill off a generation, and to keep the women that were left back, because he only wanted to kill the males, keep the women as his slaves and servants and what's not, and probably as concubines and so forth. So basically, this is a very heinous type of plan. Kill all the men, leave the women, and so forth. And so he told the midwives, and the funniest part that it seemed that the midwives may have been Hebrews, could have been Hebrews, but it says he told the midwives, when you see is a boy, kill him. If you see is a girl, leave her. But this verse 7, he says something very important. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. Verse 8 says, so the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing? And saved the male children. And this is what the midwives said to the Pharaoh. The Hebrew women, they're not like Egyptian women. They are lively and they give birth before the midwives can come to them. And the truth is that there's some truth in this, because even in slavery with us, persons who live in luxury and persons who work the field, the reality is that people who work the field were a bit more fit, a bit more robust. They were used to pain. They were used to pushing past. And one thing I found out by some research is that truth is that when you find that's our reality, then basically people who are from these areas where a lot of work, they a lot of work in the land and stuff like that, when they give birth, they have a high pain tolerance, and it's usually very fast. They usually take it themselves. It's not a lot of C-sections probably or what's not. But the truth is, when you get a situation with when you have a society where people would come to a place like maybe we live in a lot of luxury and so forth. We don't do as much work. We find that birth becomes a bit more well, from my research, I don't want to seem strange and misogynistic, but it seems that birth becomes a bit more harder. So what they were saying wasn't altogether wrong, and so forth. So basically, they gave that example. They're lively. They give birth before you even get to the house. The child don't come. So in verse 20, it says, therefore God dealt well with the middle-aged. God looked favorably on them, and let the people multiply and grew very mightily. And so it was, the midwives feared God, and he provided households for them. And this is translated that he basically blessed their households and made sure that their household thrived and flourished, and so forth. So then, because Pharaoh could not control the midwives, he then turned towards the people, the Egyptians, and said, hey, listen, if you see somebody, if you see an Israelite having a baby boy drowning, cast him in the river. And every daughter you shall save alive. So he turned it from the midwives and he opened it up to the people and said, no, you're basically these people in the same way. Like, it's so amazing how much comparison we have today. But he said, listen, storm the capital. Take it into your own hands. Don't rely upon the authorities or what's on the midwives. If you see something, do something. So this is the context that Moses is growing up in. It's a very, one could call it a racist environment. It's very, we call it xenophobic. That's a word that is used, meaning that there's a lot of nationality here. People are making decisions based on where you're from and who you are. And this is one of the things that could have known, like we see some of the things happen to Jews in much thousands of years they did with the Holocaust, where they believed that they were discouraged the earth and they didn't deserve this and they were below humans and stuff like that. So we see something similar happening here, and this is our reality that Moses would have grown up, luckily grown up in. So from here now we can springboard. We see the hand of God working so far. I'm going to pause now because that was just supposed to be an introduction. We're going to pause now for any thoughts, anything that you've learned as we would have gone through that, as gone through Exodus 1. From verse 8 to 22, then we can move on to Exodus chapter 2. So we understand that even before Moses was there, even before things happened, even though that things were very bad, God had his hand in this reality to protect Moses. The midwives feared God. Any thoughts as so far as we are discussing here? Any thoughts so far? Everybody can hear me, right?
Yes, we can.
Everybody can hear you, and I think the introduction is very interesting because I just want to relate to something in Genesis chapter 15, verse 13. God was telling Abram before he became Abraham that his seed is going to be a stranger in a land for over 400 years. And that was a prophecy that was to be fulfilled. And here we see in Exodus that God is about to do something.
Yeah, very true.
He's about to do something. And you will notice that in Exodus chapter 1 that the people were crying out for deliverance. But as you go into chapter 2, I will make some more statements. I will give you an opportunity to introduce chapter 2.
No problem. So I'm going to be jumping back and forth between Exodus 2 and Acts 7. Did you know, well, for those of you who may not come, welcome to those who are on YouTube. Did you know that there's a whole entire synopsis of Moses' life in Acts? I was very happy to find it. And it gives some very interesting thing. It gives a very, very good summary, very concise summary. We're going to compare that with Exodus 2. So it starts by, I'll read as Brother Jordan started, read Acts, and we can kind of pick up from there. In Acts, it says, I'll read Acts, somebody else could jump into Exodus 2. It says, at this time Moses was born. He was well pleasing to God. In Exodus, it says that his mother saw him, as Brother Jordan said, she was very beautiful. He was beautiful. He was a goodly child. What that means, essentially, from my research, it could be that she saw some semblance of what he was going to be, or he could have just been a very pretty baby. But she received a vision from God and told her who he should be. something about this baby she saw as special, and it drove, what one could argue, it drove her to do what she did. But the truth is that as a mother of a child, she might have done this anyway. The funny thing is that every parent thinks that their child is the most beautiful thing, is the most beautiful thing on the face of the earth, and they're not wrong to them, but it's very subjective. But it says that the mother, she saw that he was beautiful. And so it starts with, so it goes on to say, this is in Acts 7, verse 20. Acts 7, verse 20. And going on to, well pleasing to God, he was brought up in his father's house for 3 months. Now, there's some persons who think that really and truthfully that Moses was raised by his mother until he was 12. There's some debate about that, but that's not necessary for right now. The fact is that his mother had a hand in it. We go forward. Well, actually, no. Let me pause here. There's some things I want to bring out that only come out in Exodus 2. So let me pause here. Yeah, let me pause here. And let's go on to Exodus 2, because the rest, from verse 23, it talks about what happens next in terms of when he became an adult and so forth. So let's look back to Exodus 2. Can somebody read verses 3 of Exodus 2 for me? Verses 3 of Exodus 2. And we're going to go on to about verses 9 to 10, sorry. So verses 3 to 10, somebody please unmute and please read for me. And you can read it from any version, any version of the Bible that you have. Those on YouTube, thanks for joining us again. Feel free to send your questions on YouTube, and we'll ask them here. And those in Zoom, you can feel free to post your questions, and we'll ask them as we go along, or we can just ask it out loud. So somebody read for me Exodus chapter 2, verses 3 to 10.
Okay, I'll read from the Amplified Version. When she could no longer hide him, she got him a basket made of papyrus reeds and covered it with tar and pitch, making it waterproof. Then she put the child in it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. And his sister, Miriam, stood some distance away to find out what would happen to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came to bathe at the Nile, and she, together with her maidens, walked along the river's bank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to get it, and she brought it to her. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. And she took pity on him and said, "This is the one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a wet nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go ahead." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, and said, "Because I drew him out of the water."
Now, this is just purely because I'm fascinated by it, and I'm not going to spend a long time on it. But it's interesting to know that the concept of Moses, the name Moses, she said, "Because I drew him out of the water." The reality is that for royalty in Egypt, every person in the royal, whether we're a son, we're a descendant of Pharaoh, or what's not, every person born, every child born was usually named to indicate that they were born of a god, right? To indicate their superiority to everybody else. And the word born of was essentially what we would call Mose, or Mose, right? And the truth is, so basically we have a lot of names that start with like Themos or Amos or something like that, and basically it would speak towards like Ramos, what we call Ramesses, is basically son of Ra, which is the sun god. So essentially what we see here, some people say that the most that we see here, which is taken from, well, is kind of, what we see here is Hebrew, but it has alliterations, but it has examples in Egyptian as well. Basically, she may have not want to give him a name that was of Egyptian god because she didn't know his parentage. Anyway, that was just a little by the way thing, because the most that we see there was actually used by other children. That part, like how Elijah, El in Elijah, and El in most names in Hebrew names, El stands for God. So right, so God is my provider, God is my right. So it was similar to that in Egyptian not continuity, Egyptian culture. That's just a by the way. I thought it was very interesting. But there's some interesting things coming out from here that we should know. Now, thank you for reading, Shara. There's some points that I really want to point out. And one of you realized it. Number one, Moses, well, let me go, I will go there last. The reality is that Moses is growing up, and he a very big reality in his life this far. Not that he is in any courts or in Pharaoh's household. Women played a huge role in him being in his salvation, essentially, in his continued safety. For instance, it started out, count it with me. It started out with the but his mother and father, of course, but I mean, had to come together. But start with the women, the persons, the maids that usually help. I can't remember the name. I had a name just now. Hold a second. The midwives, right? They start with the midwives who refused to carry out the Pharaoh's orders. Women. His mother refused to let her child die, and she pledged a very, very important and amazing plan to do something, to try something. And the funniest part is that, don't forget, they were ordered to drown. They're basically to drown. The people were ordered to drown these Hebrew children in the river. And here she was putting her child in extreme harm's way in the same river. I'm basically allowing God to do his will. Then his sister watched over him as he glided along to make sure that everything happened. And then a woman, Pharaoh's daughter, came out and saw this little boy and decided to adopt him. Basically, from the midwife's mother, daughter, Pharaoh, women had a very important role to play in his safety to ensuring that Moses would become who he was. And I thought it was a very interesting reality. Right?
But
anybody else? Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting about that story is that when Moses' sister had the conversation with Pharaoh's daughter that she's gonna take it to the person and nurse her, that his sister never told Pharaoh's daughter that the woman that she can take the baby to was actually his mother, you know.
It's true. Mm-hmm.
When in verse 8 it says, and Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go, and the maid went and called for the child's mother. That sister never told Pharaoh's daughter that the woman that she carried the baby to was actually the mother.
But funny enough, and to add to what you're saying, Stephen, it says in verse 9, it says then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. And the next verse says, so the woman took the child and nursed him. As we refer to him as mother, it was like so much. So like no, and the commentary makes a very interesting point where it says, I see your hand there, Sterling. Makes a very interesting point where it says that the amount of discipline to hold away your affection, not to cast any aspersions, not to indicate anybody that this is your little boy, this is your love of your life. Even to give him back, like how Hannah gave back Samuel, took an amazing amount of discipline and that I can't fathom. That's the honest truth. What was it like to live in constant fear of death of your child? You know, that's amazing. That's interesting to see and to witness. So I see your hand, Sterling. Let's hear from Sterling, and I see your hand, Brother Jordan, afterwards.
Okay, isn't it, good everybody? Isn't it also interesting to note that every son that was born should be cast into the river, right? But yet the daughter could bring this son into the palace. You see? Isn't that interesting to note that as well?
So that's interesting. And the one thing that we see is that, so a couple things there. The only sons that were supposed to be killed were the Hebrew boys. The Egyptian boys were fine. What we see is interesting. So the lady, the daughter of Pharaoh, what we call a princess, we may call her, saw this Hebrew boy, and it says clearly that she understood and she saw that he was Hebrew. And she decided to save him, although she knew what her father had determined. And basically, against his orders, against everything, basically she gave a coverage, basically a level of protection over him. So it's very ironic that she would have seen this little boy floating in the water, knowing fully well what her father had said to drown him, and said, you know what, no, not this little boy. I find it to be very, 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 very interesting. I'm not sure if I answer your question, but I do agree it's very interesting. Very interesting.
Yes,
Go ahead.
Yes, actually, Cyril was asking the same question that I was planning to ask, but I would even want to go a little further, because I also wondered about the fact that that Hebrew child was supposedly one of the children ordered by her father to be killed. All right, and how is it that she could choose to take that child back to the palace, and her father knowing that it's a Hebrew child, and he still accepted it as well? Now, when you go back earlier in the chapter, and the scripture reading that I read earlier that spoke about Moses as a beautiful child, I believe that the beauty was not merely physical. I think that beauty also brought the fact that from very early, even as a baby, the Spirit of God was in Moses, and that was the defining factor that providence was able to save Moses from being destroyed like any other child. Because as the scriptures point out quite clearly, he was a very special child. His parents, from the very outset, saw that he was actually the deliverer. They recognized that God was going to use him to be the one to do it. And of course, it would have meant that God would have actually spoken to them to let them know that this child is a very special child. So they would know they have to take special care of him to protect his life and to do all the things necessary to preserve that life so that he can later fulfill his mission. So taking all that into consideration, all that, whatever is said and done, Moses was specially protected by God himself. And even though he went into the palace, or I should say enemy territory, and still survived, clearly meant that God always intended to preserve him to perform the mission that he had to perform.
That's an excellent point, Brother Jordan. And the truth is, as we go into, I see your hands, Brother Charles. Huh? That's somebody else. Oh, let's see how Brother Charles. As we go in more into this study, we will see the hand of God on Moses so much times, especially when we look at the history, the culture of the time, the culture that he grew up in. The fact that he got as far as he did was nothing short of amazing and nothing short of supernatural. Let me put it that way. Nothing short of supernatural. Brother Clark.
Yeah, good night, everybody.
Good night.
I like us, as you know, to get out of the story and come into the reality and the application of it. I think Brother Jordan, in his closing remarks, did make the point that I am going to make, but I want to go even further than that. I want to say that when you look at the Moses, yes, God he was the deliverer of the children of Israel, but the overarching point is that God is in control. Mm-hmm. And although Satan, using Pharaoh, was trying to get rid of God's people at that time, if you look at it, God had determined that he was going to bring back his people. He was going to rescue his people from Pharaoh, from the Egyptian. And he did so amid everything, bringing Moses up in the household. Likewise, when Jesus came on the scene, and you got to understand the whole picture behind it. This is the great controversy. When Jesus came on the scene, a similar thing happened. When Herod wanted to get rid of the son, but God told the parents to move, again, another deliverer, to move to think God is in control. And the application I want to make is that it is not only unique to Moses. God is in control of our situation. God's in control of the COVID situation. God's still in control, although Russia seems to be taking advantage of Ukraine. God is in control, and he will bring deliverance in the right time. Lots of persons most likely would have died in Egypt under the rigorous rule that they were under. But God was in control, and in due time, God is in control. God is in control of every situation. That's my point.
Thanks. Well said. Well said. Brother Stephen, I see your hand.
Well, the Spirit probably said that Moses was like a sack of Christ. Was like a Christ.
A type of Christ, yeah.
Yeah, type of Christ. He went up in the mount, and the same way that Jesus went up, he went up. You understand? And it's very interesting, though. But I want to make a point. It seems to me that we're going forward fast, but I want to make a point in verse 11. Because I want to bring that home to our modern situation, a modern times. In verse 11, when Moses had been grown and he went out and saw his brethren.
You didn't get there yet, but make your point.
He went out and saw his brethren, and they had a kid. There was smite the Egyptian smite the Hebrew, one of the brethren, and it so happened that the same Hebrew turned around and squeezed on Moses, saying, like, the same way you kill the Egyptian, you want to kill me too. That's something we got to talk about later, but I want to make the point here. If we in our time, like, you going up Broad Street, and you see a member of your church being robbed or hustled, what will you do? Will you bypass them, or will you lend assistance or anything like that? Or you say, me, I get in that cause. I got nothing to do with me. What will you do?
Good question. Good question. We can get there.
Right.
But thanks for that. There's some other points that I want to bring up as we in this special part, or this specific part. Now, one thing, let me look at the history of and the culture of the Egyptians. The interesting thing is that the Nile. Let me see if I go back there to the verse. Because I don't think it specifically says that he was laid in the Nile River, right at the river. It says at the river. But one interesting thing, the truth is that the Nile River played a very important part in Egyptian life, and there was a lot of branches and what's not that came off it that people used. But the interesting thing is that the Nile itself is seen as sacred to the Egyptians. And basically, it was actually worshipped. The Nile River was actually worshipped as a god. So this is an interesting fact to realize. Why would it? But made me think about persons bathing in the river. The truth is that would not have been the action, well, that we understand, the usual action of the ability to bathe in a common river that is available or accessible by the common or even the slaves. But here we see, if it was the Nile River, the truth is there was properties associated and spirituality associated with the Nile River, which would have drawn her to go and bathe in it, because the Nile was worshipped again as a god and seen as a giver of different types of gifts and so forth. So it was interesting that, honestly, seeing the baby come into her on this river may have actually played into, God may have used the culture of the time to actually affect her as well, because she may have seen this as a gift from the gods, because the river was associated with such things as well. That's one thing I wanted to bring up as interesting. As we go forward, as Stephen alluded to, into verse 11, we raise that if we compare the two situations, the two realities together, in terms of if we compare our slavery of Black people with the slavery of the Egyptians, of the Israelites, the truth is that how Moses grew up, we would call a sunny plantation, or rather Charlie plantation. Basically, that's when your father was a slave master, and your mother was a slave. but Moses did not. He grew up in the household. He was not in any way, shape, or form even half or part Egyptian. He was whole Hebrew. And the truth is that while he was an adopted son, even then there was some evidence, I would say, that he didn't have the full freedom, as we will see, to say it. We can look at that as we go forward. So Urban makes a very important point in the YouTube chat. Thanks for making it, Urban. He says, and this is mentioned from before, while there was no explicit mention of Moses' family being identified as such, the arrangement with the sister being nearby would have been in all likelihood entirely transparent to the Egyptians. And he goes on to say, a wet nurse likely just gave birth. So, and the reality is, yeah. So thank you for sharing that. I don't want to go too far into it. But so Urban is asking a question on the Zoom. He says, you have to rephrase that, Urban. He's asked, could it have been possible? Could it also have been, this talking about Pharaoh's daughter, could it also have been that she did our equivalent of going to the beach? Okay, I understand what you're saying. That's quite possible as well, that she was just going to the beach to bathe at the beach or bathing regularly, you bathe at the beach. That's quite possible as well. But again, in doing research, usually, but if nobility went to that place, like they would not go to a place where their lives might be in danger by persons who didn't like them and stuff like that. So this, if she went on a beach in our context, should have gone on a beach that was well a private beach. The one that Gabby signed so eloquently against. He said that beach is mine. But yes, that's a good point. So when we look at verse 11 of Exodus, actually, I'll jump back into at this point. Jump back into I see your hand, Sterling, but jump back into Acts. Actually, no, let's come back because we haven't gone there as yet. It says, no, it came to pass in those days when Moses had grown, he was out to his brethren and looked at their burdens. That's in verse 11. Very, very importantly, because we read it, if you have Acts 7, you'll see something. How old was Moses actually when this situation happened? Because we skip past all of his training, all of his life as a young boy in Egypt and what's not. We skip back to a point in time in his life. Can anybody tell me how old Moses was when he would have, but this thing when he killed the person, the Egyptian, and when he would have ran? Can anybody tell me indicate how old he would have been? Because some of us would have watched coming up watching movies like where's now the cartoon Prince of Egypt and so forth. Can anybody tell me how old Moses was when he killed the guy and ran? I see Brent obviously got your answer. Welcome, Brent.
Well, thank you. Good evening, Paul, and good evening, everyone. He would have been around, I think, around 40 years of age.
You're correct.
Because in the book of the book of Acts also, but other than that, also in the book of Patriarch and Prophet, it mentioned that he had to take 40 years in preparation to be God's mouthpiece for him before Pharaoh, right? So it took X amount of time to get rid of what needed to be shed so that he can do God's will. Because, sometimes you look at our lives and we grow up. Some of us may become Christians in our 20s, some even later, as the case may be. And we have to learn now to change or adopt the ways of God, because people knew that this man's supposed to be our deliverer, and also knowing that he himself thought that he would be the deliverer of Israel via a mighty hand. He would control the army of Egypt, and because he will control the army of Egypt, all will be well. But he had to understand that it was his way. And I get too far forward, but nonetheless, though, he was basically around that age.
Right.
Yes.
Thank you. Sterling, your hand was up. Let's hear from you.
Yes, I know you move on to 11, but I was still looking back at 7, at verse 7. when Miriam was so quick. I know she was there watching all the time, and she was so quick to approach Vera's daughter to tell her, "Shall I go and call to a nurse?" I was thinking that quickness of her doing that and saying what she said was a way of getting Moses back home, because here is that other mothers would have lost their sons, and here is Moses was like reunited with the mother, like a family again.
Okay, and interesting. So essentially said she wanted to lick rather than somebody else being, as you said, somebody else being used as a wet nurse, because as I think as Earl suggested, they may have, at this time, many women who had just given birth who don't have a son. So the many women who could have been wet nurses. So as you said, Miriam jumped in there and said, "Hey, I know one that can do it." And she added very fast. I mean, again, women doing some amazing things and thinking very fast and thinking on the feet. And
getting him back in, with the mother.
With his mom, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
Reuniting them back together, something like that.
So, and we also see, so in this we see, as Brother Jordan, Brother Charles as well alluded to, we see God's hand in this. This is working out just fine. Nobody was refused and said, "Oh no, I got somebody in line." It worked out that was able to be raised at some point by his actual natural mother in a time where other children be ripped away from their parents. That's a blessing. And we take the whole second. This is a point by Brian and a point by Brother Jordan.
Is it interesting also that we can note that if it was that for some strange reason, let's say a wet nurse was found in Egypt, what would have been the consequences of that? Because sometimes I remember Eli and his boys, and he was very timid as to discipline them in the right way. And he was like, "Wait till they're old. When they're older, then we're going to discipline them. They will have more understanding." But in this case, God saw it fit that the child will go back to his paternal mother to be taught the ways of God well, that when he was in the presence of the priests of Egypt, no matter what they said in connection with this being a God and that being a God, and we need to worship him, he was steadfast and firm as a rock, didn't move. And even though he was like this, they didn't enforce the rule that, listen, if you don't learn this here, you're not going to be the viceroy of Egypt, as the case may be, and so forth. So and it's for us today. Do not take lightly the training of our children. Sometimes we allow some things to pass which we shouldn't allow to pass. We give things we shouldn't give. And so we put it in the enemy's hand, not realizing that, look, this will slide down a slope very quickly and we would not be able to draw them back. It was the right age, right time, because she had him until he was about 12. And then after that, try as they may to turn his mind from the living God, they weren't able to do that. And that's interesting. Other thing, just wanted to pop and mention, if you all didn't already, the name. His name Moses was given by his adopted mother, and consequently enough, in the Egyptian language, that name means royalty. So here we see Moses being given a name from the heathen language of royalty, and this child is a Hebrew child. So God's hand was fully in it, guiding and directing the events that took place. Back to you.
Thanks, Brian. We can take Brother Jordan and then Brother Clark, and we can move forward a bit. Go ahead, Brother Jordan.
Yes. What I would want us to see in all of Moses' story is that in many ways, we can see ourselves being under the hand of God's providential care, even if in lesser matters of life than what Moses himself would have been subjected to. When you really study it carefully, it amazed me about Moses and his history that God had already appointed Moses to be the deliverer of Israel from Egypt. And yet, Moses went to Egypt partly for the purpose of being prepared for that mission. Although we are told that when he spent 40 years in the desert, that was part of his preparation. But really and truly, his preparation really began in Egypt, because the features of Moses and that experience in Egypt, that he was an excellent leader. The Spirit probably tells us that he was well respected, well looked up to, well adhered to, and therefore he was even seen as the future king of Egypt. He made the decision to break his ties there. But even in our own lives, we oftentimes see God's providential care as he moves us from one stage to the next. And it goes to show how amazing God is. Right there in Egypt, God allowed Moses to stay for a period of time. But during that period of time, Moses developed and matured as a man. He learned all the skills of Egypt, right? And even though the culture of Egypt was not conducive in any way, but let me put it this way, his Christian upbringing, the fact that his mother trained him from young to be steadfast in his faith, in relationship with God, he was able to withstand all of that, come out on actually unscathed, so to speak, spiritually unscathed. It's true that he made the mistake of killing the Egyptian, but that can be understood for what it was. But it goes to show how God works in our lives, huh? And I think that as we look at Moses' life, we can also look at how God could be using us too, what he could be taking us through, what that we're probably going through, or experiences we're going through, because he might be taking us through something to lead us to somewhere else. And that's what we also need to look at.
Right. So is that we want to rush ahead? Sorry, not rush. We want to go ahead, move ahead. So let's do that. I want to read because what all we saw from Ellen White. So from Ellen White, she actually takes a lot from Acts as well, because it's said in Bible. So Acts 7 verse 21 says, when he was set out, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him as her own son. Verse 22 says, Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, as we rightfully just said, Brother Jordan, and was mighty in words and deeds. Verse 23 says, now when he was 40 years old, this is Acts 7, verse 23. Now when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren and the children of Israel. Verse 24, and seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended and avenged him who was oppressed, and struck down the Egyptians, for he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand, but they did not understand. So let's touch on this a bit. I like how Stephen, well not our Stephen, but Stephen from the Bible kind of encapsulates or just summarizes all of this into down one. He gives a bit more information to go on. Starts by saying that Pharaoh was that Moses was versed again, as you said, in the wisdom of the Egyptians. He calls it wisdom. The wisdom of Egypt, all the good things. And he was mighty in word and deeds, which indicated that before he took this stance, at this stage when he killed the guy, he was doing some big stuff. He was doing some amazing stuff. The words, and not only in words, not only in theory, but in deeds, he did stuff. So now we see now in verse 23, and it says he was 40 years old, which is interesting, by the way, because when you actually, if you raise that, okay, he killed the guy at 40. He ran and escaped at 40. He went to Midian. In Midian, he spent 40 years tending sheep. That's when God called him after that 40 years. So basically at 40, he ran. At 80, he was called by God. And he spent the next 40 years leading the children of Israel. It's interesting that Moses' life moved in 40 year spans. If you think about it, 40 years in Egypt, 40 years in Midian, 40 years with the Israelites. So it says here that basically, as we know, he's being built up as this. Why would we not think that he is being built up as a savior to his people? So he goes, and it says he goes and he spends time with his people, and he sees an Egyptian unfearing his people. And it's interesting that he makes a move at this point in time to defend his brethren. And he basically, in his movement, he kills the Egyptian and he saves his brother. We see that. But then something interesting happens, and Stephen points out the very, very interesting point in Acts 7, where he says, the next day, in verse 26 of Acts 7, the next day he appeared to two of them as they were fighting. Two of them, meaning we see in Exodus chapter 2, two Hebrews. They were fighting amongst each other, and he tried to reconcile them and saying, men, you are brothers. Why do you wrong one another? But he who did his neighbor wrong pushed him away, pushed Moses away and said, who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you did the Egyptian yesterday? And so that's what Stephen outlines it. From Exodus, if I could jump into that, is in Exodus chapter 2, verses 13. He says, and he went on the second day, behold, two Hebrew men were fighting. He said to the one who did it wrong, why are you striking your companion? He said, who made you a prince and judge over us? So the funniest thing is that, again, God had ordained or brought Moses for such a time as this. And I believe, as you said, that Moses may believe that he was, all the things that happened so far in his life was putting him in a position to help his brothers, even to free them. To free them, not only freedom, free them. And here was his fellow brother, as Stephen painfully outlines, look at him and saying, who made you rule over me? And the thing is, one thing that he goes on to say, do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? And it says next in verse 14, so Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. So which means he believed that when he killed the man, it was only known to the guy that he saved. He was trying to do it in private and what's not, but it was known. And news was spreading. It had already spread amongst the Hebrews, so much so that these new people knew. But the commentary for this makes a very interesting point. It says, if they did not know, well, basically it seems like Moses' act to help his brethren to stop fighting of itself was a good thing. Especially if he thought it was getting to a point where, this needs to get this de-escalated. But because of his act the previous day, it colored his actions in this reality. What was supposed to be a good thing in telling persons, don't fight, let's work together. What was supposed to be a good thing was seen as bad simply because of actions that happened the day before. And it was interesting to see also that basically here, his own people who are slaves, looking at a man who, like them, I don't know if it's like how we say how slaves and field slaves could agree or they see eye to eye. But the reality is, here was a slave. I'm seeing my friend, my guy, my person, my own person, fighting for me, and basically he ain't killing other Hebrews, he's killing Egyptians. Why would he treat his fellow man this way? And it's interesting to think, in the Bible, when Jesus went to Nazareth to preach among them, he says that something very important: a prophet is not honored in his own country. And we see this as stark revelation right here. And I find it so amazing. As like, what other options do you have? Why would you turn away someone like you who is fighting for you? What are your thoughts so far on this as we move on and go forward to then we can talk about the flight of Moses. Then by 8 o'clock, hopefully we will get to we will pass the Midian part because we want to stop when he ran to Midian. Go ahead.
How will you relate to a situation like that in our times? I think I made the point earlier, but you didn't wait on it.
Sorry, repeat it. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Huh?
Go ahead. Repeat what the question was.
I made the point of that. But the two when Moses saw the killing going on, and they tried to relate it to our time.
Right.
How will you put that into our modern context? When you go somewhere and you saw your brother or your sister or some family or your member of the church in trouble, somebody robbing them or beating them. Will you lend a sister or will you say me again and that could I for me?
That's a good question.
There are situations that we face in our time that will need our assistance. And sometimes we don't jump in and help the person.
It is very, very true. But Clark, you have an answer?
I'm not answering our question. Stephen answered the question. He said sometimes. I want to observe a few things. I want to observe a few points. I want to go back to a point made by Cashier and Brother Jordan, just for a little more emphasis on it, and that is the role of child rearing. Moses' mother had a limited time, and all I want to say to all of us who are raising children, we only have a limited time to raise our children to fear and honor God. And I think that sometimes we may think that we have a longer time, but she had that limited period and she maximized that period. If you look at the book, in the book, Patriarchs and Prophets, the servant of the Lord have underscored that. So those very tender ages, those formative years are very, very important for child rearing. The next point I want to make is that the point that was made by Stephen, that's Stephen the martyr, that Moses was well educated, well learned in all the Egyptians, so on. And when you come back to a point when he met at the burning bush and the excuses, we can argue another thing. But the point that I really want to make is that he was well educated, and God, and because he was well educated, God used him significantly. He wrote a significant part of the Old Testament. On the other hand, we had another very educated person again who was educated again in the New Testament, which is the Apostle Paul or Saul, very educated, and God was able to use him. And the point that I'm saying I want to make is that those guys, because I believe of their background, they were able to do certain exploits. But God also used Peter, and he also used Jude. I use those two deliberately because Jude, who some believe was probably one of his half brothers, only wrote one chapter, and Peter, a person without education, God used. And the point I want to make is that God can use all of us in whatever capacity. God used when he met Moses was delivered, as we said. God used him mightily. He wrote a significant portion of the Old Testament. We met the Apostle Paul. God used him. He wrote a significant part of the New Testament. Those are just the 2 points I want to make.
Thanks a lot for that, Brother Clark. Brother Clark, thanks a lot for that. Your hand is still up. Right. So we move on now. So one thing, there's some facts I want to share with you as we move on to I want to ask you some questions. Right. So I'll give some information, ask some questions as we move forward. So Moses, after this situation, he understood that he did wrong and people knew and so forth. So he decided to run. Let me ask a question on a serious note. It might seem obvious. Why would Moses need to run? Now, understand carefully that Moses is not a slave as other slaves. Moses is, by all intents and purposes, a prince. He was raised as a prince. Why would he need to run? And why would he need to run? Because his mother had been able, his adopted mother had been able to protect him, like she had protected him for all those years. Why would he then need to run?
That's a good question, Paul. And I believe the answer is that a Jew killing an Egyptian is serious stuff.
Tell me more.
No matter what status he held, once you mess with an Egyptian, once a Jew did anything wrong to an Egyptian, you are in serious trouble. So that's why he had to run. Even though he was one of the hierarchies in the Egyptian government, as much as powerful as he was, as brilliant a leader as he was, as much as he excelled in his position, that is, he was a Hebrew killing an Egyptian, and that's a serious thing. Understand that when it comes to fraternizing Hebrews and Egyptians used to draw lines at certain intervals. Hebrews don't let sheep people. Egyptians don't let sheep people. Right? And Hebrews are sheep people. They keep sheep, right? And that sort of stuff. And there are certain disparities that always existed between, even though they all live in the same country, there are certain disparities that still remain between both the Egyptians and the Hebrews, right? So it was a serious crime for a Hebrew to kill each other, regardless of what the circumstances were. So he knew danger, and therefore we had to flee for his life.
That's a great point. And the one thing that it showed me was that even though he had all this great privilege growing up, the fact is he made one very bad mistake, and that mistake was enough in his mind to undo all the goodwill amongst the Egyptians that he had built up. He knew they were looking after him to kill him. One thing that I want to bring out, because you also mentioned that the Egyptians or the Hebrews. The Hebrews at this point were still they're still slaves and still seen in the derogatory manner. This 40 years has passed by. And the truth of the matter is, we are not even told in the Bible if the mandate to kill the sons had ever stopped. We don't know. This is reality. So basically, the last thing we saw in the end of chapter 1 was that basically Pharaoh had given that mandate to kill these boys, the Hebrew boys, to the people of Egypt. Basically, if you see a male child, kill them, drown them in the water. And imagine years and years and years of that festering, because there was nothing there to kind of pull that together. Probably Moses may have tried, or Moses may have been a beacon of hope to some people. But the truth is that the time that we see, there was no change. And we see it in the fact that there was no area of agreement, in that this man, this Egyptian, was beating his fellow man mercilessly, as we say, mercilessly. They were still in subjection. They were still seen as lesser. So the truth is, for all the goodwill that Moses may have had, as a son of the princess, he still couldn't think. And basically, when you look at the history of the Egyptians and what's not, in terms of how they made moves, there were cousins that tried to depose other cousins, and daughters that tried to depose sons to get power and what's not. This may have been a volatile time, especially the time that the historians believe Moses would have become prominent or grew up in. So it's a very interesting point you made, but the Jordanites for making it. But another question I want to ask, again, Stephen outlines, the patriarch Stephen outlines that Moses killed this man at 40 years. Now, understand that Hebrews would have been slaves for years. In fact, chapter 1 tells us that Pharaoh reigned in them, and they were grieved. So what changed? This is not a question we can really answer truthfully, but in your mind, what would have changed after 40 years? It's not like Moses grew up and did not see the injustice done to Hebrews. It was a reality when he was a child. So why did it take 40 years for him to get to a point? Can we relate to that in any way? Is that a rough question?
It's a good question, Paul. Why it took 40 years?
It would have taken 40 years.
Remember that Moses was in Egypt for 40 years. And I guess as far as God is concerned, it would take another 40 years for him to unlearn. Changes. And at the same time, make the necessary preparation for for the role he was to assume at that point in time. There was a lot about Moses. Even though he was a chosen man of God, there was a lot about Moses when he left Egypt. He still had a lot of Egypt in him when he left. And it would have taken some time for God to work with him to undo all of that in order to help him, in order to be able to use him, rather, to accomplish the mission of delivering his people. There was a point I wanted to make as concerning something that you said earlier, but it kind of slipped me for the time being, but if it comes back, I'll mention it. But there's just that, that wilderness experience. The spirit of prophecy tells us that it was supposed to shake off all the pride and all those, things that he inculcated as a student, as a a member of the Egyptian family, all that had to be removed from him, so that God is now shaping him into a different kind of an image now. Because for God to be able to use him, God's spirit will have to dwell in him in order for him to be able to manifest everything about God himself. Because Moses not only was a leader, one designated to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt, but also, as such, also manifested the character of God in his own life, so that he will always be seen as an ideal and proper example to show what kind of God, the kind of person God really is, and that the Egyptians will see God truly as they are to see him through Moses, so that they themselves, having been in Egypt for so long and being spoiled in idolatry and all these bad practices and so on, now begin to see, to be given a new start, given a new dimension to their lives. So a whole lot of stuff had to take place in the 40 years. And God, it may seem a long time, but God knows that we human beings sometimes don't always learn as fast as we should. So he takes his time, but once we are submissive, he will accomplish his purposes in his given time.
That's a great point. Thank you for sharing that, Brother Jordan. That's a great point. Before you get to Brian, Irvin says, talking about Moses, perhaps Moses thought that he would liberate Israel as a Pharaoh. And that's a good point as well, Irvin. And one thing that came out in some research, again, about this time, if Moses lived in a certain time, the reality is that this may have been a time where his adopted mother may have been looking to consolidate power. So this was a time where shifts were happening, and Moses may have been using that as an advantage to move forward. And things. So is we're just talking a theory right now. It's a possibility. Brian, but I still take what brother Jordan is saying is very very powerful, and it applies to us today.
Yeah, there's an old saying: "Old habits die hard," meaning that many of us now today are in our wilderness, and there are a lot of things that we do, that we have within our system, that needs to be bled out, and it takes time. God knew this, and Sister White makes the point that sometimes what man considers as insignificant, because we will say, "Man, all you're doing is taking care of sheep in the wilderness," but it was more than that. If you know,
don't forget, we in the wilderness just yet. We studied 40 years when he was in thing.
No. If you understand what I'm saying, old habits die hard, right? He had to go to the wilderness in order to unlearn what God wanted him to unlearn, so that he can instill in him the right way. And just as he was in his wilderness in that 40-year period, we also are in our wilderness when we accept Christ. And, we take time also to get rid of the bad habits that would tie us to this place, that will keep us down. Right? Basically, it's along that same analogy that I'm saying it. Because Sister White makes the point that many persons would look at a situation like that and say, "Man, that's a waste of time. You in the taking care of sheep for 40 years, sometimes some of us are sometimes in some particular jobs, and we would use the statement, this are deadbeat job. This ain't getting you nowhere." But that's what we say. But at the end of the journey, as the case may be, we may see a different conclusion. What people may say is, "Well, that ain't do nothing." And it's a point that we need to learn and realize that, look, God's ways are not our ways. He does things in a different manner. He doesn't do it like how we expect. We think that, all right, you go to school, you get education, and after you get education, you get all the degrees, you come out now, you're ready for it. But when you go to work, the world is telling, listen, everything that you studied in that book, throw it out. You got a new system that you need to follow. And it's important for us to see this and understand this in the light of how God works. Moses thought that the people would be delivered by his hand. But God is showing him now, no, that is not the way I work. I work a different way. I walk a different beat. And you have to learn of me in order to be able to be used by me.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that. So as we skip along quickly, because we're getting close, of course, and I'm going to jump along to the escape. The truth is that when Moses escaped, the question I want to ask is how do you think how easy was it for Moses to escape at this point in time? Because don't forget that we're not just talking about I lived in Barbados and I'm going from St. Michael to St. Lucie. We're talking about the escape in Egypt. Egypt is a kind of well, in this place might be a fortified city. He had to get past watchtowers. He had to get past a whole number of places. He had to cross over, and he's in the desert. He had to cross over long stretches of things. In fact, it says that from Egypt to Midian, because the Midianites were really nomads. So the land of Midian is not any one set place. It's a wide spot. But to get from Egypt to where Moses ended up, he would have had to walk. It was about 360 miles away. If he had walked 20 miles a day, he would have had to walk 20 miles a day for 18 days to get from where he was to where he ended up. That's a guesstimate. 20 miles a day for 18 days, short of a month of escaping if he was walking. And the reality is, when we look at a similar flight from Egypt to the desert, from a different that was chronicled in different places. The truth is, the accounts of what it takes to get from one place to the next was harrowing. Surviving the desert on its own was a problem. So Moses' journey from one place to the next may not have been easy, but the fact is that he made it. He ended up in Midian. And the interesting part about Midian, the Midianites, was that they were descendants of Abraham. Basically, they came from Abraham's marriage to Keturah, his wife after Sarah. So essentially, I think I'm right there. They say his second wife after Sarah, Keturah. So basically, Midianites were actually the cousins of the Israelites. And it's interesting to see when we look further down in Exodus chapter 2 that they would have recognized, it almost seems as if the Midianites were kind of neutral in this reality. They saw the Egyptians had their cousins in bondage, but they helped the Egyptian, not knowing that he was a Hebrew at the time. But by the time that God came to Moses and in burning bush, when Moses was convicted that he should go and help his people, he went to Jethro, his father-in-law at the time, and said, I have to go to my people. And Jethro said, go on, what do you think? So basically, Jethro would have known that Moses was a Hebrew. And the funniest thing is that the Midianites became, although they came out as cousins, became the total opposite of as enemies in Moses' lifetime. They went from being allies to the time he judges just after his death to enemies. So when we study the book of Gideon, we realize that the Midianites were the ones that were messing up Gideon and stealing all the crops and what's not. Midianites are the Amalekites. So something happened in that time that caused real strife between Israelites and the Midianites. Now, as we go on, we understand that Moses would have gone into the land. We had a situation much like what we see with Jacob when he goes and helps feeds waters Rachel's camels. When he was on the run from his brother Esau, we see a similar thing happening here with Moses defending Jethro's daughters from the sheepmen and the shepherds, and watering their flock as well. So then their daughters, who we see here as Zipporah, carries Moses down to her father and said, but she goes to her father and says, we saw an Egyptian, and the father's like, Lefi, bring him. Let's thank him for protecting you. And so he brought him into the fold. And then we see this 40 years of Moses living in Midianite. And he's basically, when his first son is born, he basically calls him, I think it was stranger, if I'm correct. He calls his first son stranger because he's a stranger in a foreign land. So here is where I want to ask some questions as we kind of close out our study. And there's a number of questions I want to ask you. what does Moses do in these 40 years? Because I want you to put yourself in the place of Moses, because this is where we can bring it home to us. Moses was raised up as when his sons asked him, Daddy, because like at 80 years old, from 40 to 80, at the end of this time, near his time in Midian, when his sons asked him, Daddy, what was your life like? What did he say? Did you speak about his past with fondness? Because it comes across me, especially when we read the other words, that he was still, in his mind, he was still on the run. He was still in fear. In fact, when God came to him in chapter 4, I believe it is, God reminds him, says, at 80 years old, Moses, the men that were looking for you, they're dead. To confirm him, there's no fear, they're dead. And it's like after 40 years. But so basically the question is, what is Moses thinking after 40 years? Does he think, because he believed that he was there to protect and to save his people. At this point in time, he does not see the burning bush. He has not, he's not, he may be living to the point where he said, no, this is going to be my life from now on. What do you think is going through Moses' mind? And can we relate to that? Do we see, oh, sorry, let me phrase it this way. Why did Moses stay in Midian for 40 years? Is he still running? Has he moved on from where he was? What do you think his expectations were for his after 80? What do you think his expectations were? And bring to the point of at 80 years old, did he expect that his life was going to start afresh? Did he expect, or was he, when his children asked him, Daddy, who were you and what are you now? When he was spoke about his time in Egypt fondly, and I brought this here, but then my people rejected me, because he was living for 40 years with a lot of interesting emotions. But into reality, he had quote unquote been rejected, as Stephen kind of posits, by his people as, who made you rule over us? Living with that as the last thing he heard from his people before he ran. He'd been living now for 40 years, living with the fact that he was being hunted for 40 years, and basically he was unwanted by his people, unwanted by the Egyptians. So he truly is a stranger in a very strange land. And basically, was he a runaway? Was he a runaway slave at that point? The point is that he was a stranger. And did you think he expected his life to begin at 80? Well, to start back at 80? I want to hear some thoughts from you. And as you want to make some points that people are making on the YouTube. Margaret Mears says we should represent injustice directed towards the weak and poor. So anger can be used in a positive way at times. Very true, Sister Margaret. Patricia Pemberton says when Moses ran, he was not adequate to be a leader yet. Interesting. And she also says God had to mold him spiritually. The reason why God gave him the experience to care for the sheep, and when he was humble, encouraged him, God appeared to Moses at the burning bush. Now, the thing is, I agree with what you're saying, Sister Pat. What we have thousands of years later is the gift of, there's a word for it, it's gone through my mind. We have the gift to look back and see the words, and it was God. But if we placed ourselves in Moses' position at 80 years old, at 79 years old, at 75 years old, would we have had that same perspective in that I'm currently fulfilling or learning or what's not? Sometimes, well, in my opinion, sometimes when we come to the place like Moses did, sometimes it only dawns on you that God has been preparing you for this reality when you're going into it. Because when we see the burning bush happen and God appeared to Moses was like, nah, I'm done with that. I can't speak. Got the wrong person. I'm sure there must be somebody better. I'm done with that. And God had to keep reassuring him, I am with you. It is you. I can empower you. I will build you up. I can't speak properly, Lord. It was this resistance. It wasn't like he was saying, only any day now, and God appears and says, yes, I'm ready for you. What we see at the burning bush was a man who seemed to have resigned himself. For the rest of my life, I can be tending to sheep. I once was. I'm not now. What are your thoughts? That's my thought. Let's hear from you, Alfred.
Yes, Paul, I want to add a different spin to this thing. Right? Moses left Egypt around 40 years old. He defended Zipporah and her sisters from the guys that wanted to carry the stock and stuff, right? And you ask the question what Moses did in the 4 years between. Now, let me add my different spin. Moses married Zipporah, right? now this is my take. This is what I throwing out. Moses met his wife and raised a family between those 40 years. It's only when Moses was 80 then that he saw the burning bush. When God called him. And we wanted to know what was going on through Moses' mind during those 40 years. I was saying out here and saying Moses met his wife and was raising his family during that 40 years there with the Midianites. And during that time, but God was still working with Moses.
Yes.
But during that time, Moses talks, right, this is my take, Moses talks where that he now has a family and he is settling here in this land with these people until he saw the bush where God called him there.
But you're going to spend on it? Go ahead, sir. But you're saying some powerful stuff. Go ahead.
Yes, that is how I look at it. Moses had raised his family there, and God was working with him all along that time, raising his family until God decided now is the time for me to use you. That's my take on it.
And it's interesting, the point that came out in another study, I see your hand, Brother Jordan. It's interesting, a point that came out in another study, right? Basically, I don't know, but maybe it was different back then. But we see up until 40 years of age in Egypt, Moses had not even started a family. To your point, Brother Alfred, he hadn't started a family as yet. I don't know why. I don't know if it was restricted then or whatever. But we see Moses. I don't know if he was building himself up to be this thing. He didn't have time to focus on that. But the reality is he didn't start a family before 40. But no, we see, and it's a good thing. I'm not drawing too much into it, but we see there's evidence that here Moses saying, basically, I'm gonna settle.
Yes.
And that's not a bad thing. I'm gonna have a wife. I'm gonna raise my children, and I'm gonna farm some sheep, and I'm gonna have some get some. You understand what I'm trying to say? So we see an example or a thing of settling. Not that settling is bad, but he basically in his mind he was settling, and he had settled into his life. He wasn't still on the run. So we don't see him running from million to different places, hoping to continue. We see him settling into a place in relative safety and obscurity. Just putting that 2 cents. I see. You have any other points, Alfred?
No. I good. Let me take it on.
No problem. So we see Brother Jordan, then Brother Clark, then Brother Cashier. Brother Jordan.
Yes, boss. I want to introduce subject.
Oh, there, Brother Jordan. He's been coming back.
Put on his headphones.
You have on your headphones, Brother Jordan?
Sorry?
You have on your headphones?
Let me just slip it in.
Huh?
You're going to put it in.
Oh, okay, cool. All right, we can take Brother Charles, and then Brother Jordan, you can come back after Brother Charles. When you get settled.
Let Brother Jordan.
Excellent. Go ahead, Brother J.
Okay, right. I'm here with you.
Yes.
Let me just introduce a slightly different point that I'm eager to raise, because I think that the discussion on Moses 40 years, unless we prepare to go on to about 9 o'clock, we could probably save that for next week, saying that we would have been coming near the end of our time. But here's a point that I really wanted to make mention of. We brought up the question of Moses' journey from Egypt to Midian. And according to what you said, the distance was approximately 360 miles.
Yeah.
Now, that obviously would have to mean that Moses was of exceptional physical stamina to be able to last and to endure that distance. Now, that sort of awakens my mind to a point. Moses' parents trained him in the ways of the Hebrew God. And that also means training him in the way of diet. That's it. The 3 Hebrew boys, Daniel and 3 Hebrew boys, when they were in Babylon. So obviously, Moses would have had to be feeding on the right diet in order for his physical fitness to be so supreme, so to speak, to be able to endure that kind of distance. I'm thinking that this is another message to us for all of this story about Moses, that how important it is to eat right, that our diet should be right. Why? Because Moses' journey from Egypt to Midian was a kind of a mini time of trouble, if we should put it that way. Because you know what you had to endure, not only the distance, but you had to endure the weather conditions. You had to endure hunger, thirst, possibility. Well, the Bible doesn't show us that, but maybe the Lord protected from the attack of wild animals. But to travel that distance, 360 miles, not many people would be able to enjoy that. Now, for example, if Moses was a slave, I hardly think he would have gone very far in that distance. But because he was in Egypt, because he was in Egypt, and because he was serving as a part of the Egyptian government, it meant that he was entitled to the best things to eat. And I won't want to suggest that Moses went too far in eating Egyptian food. But one thing I notice about Egyptians is that they are the great exponents of mummifying. And I'm wondering if that does not begin when they are alive, that in the sense that there are things that they use for eating that helps to keep their body in such fitness, so that even when after they have to mummify them, the reason why they last for thousands of years, and they can still see some evidence of them. So take all that into consideration. The point I really want to make is this. We are approaching a time of trouble, all right? Already we can see, we have seen, and we are hearing that certain types of food, food supply is diminishing from our supermarket shelves. This war that's presently going on in Russia and Ukraine is going to spell a whole lot of danger for the world in terms of when it comes to the supply of basic needs. We need to understand that if there's a time in life where we have to start thinking differently, and when we have to start thinking differently in terms of how we are to take care of ourselves, so that throughout the duration of that time of trouble, because Sister White says that one of the things we have to endure is hunger, thirst, delay, and all the other things that will go with testing our faith and our physical strength. Therefore, we need to take heed that from all of this story, Moses was not just a man in a story, but everywhere he comes to us as an example of the fact that God brought him to where he was, used him, and that because he was obedient to his parents' teaching and to God himself, he was able to emerge as the hero that eventually became during his many years. That's just the point I want to make.
Very, very, very strong point, Brother Jordan. Thank you so much for making that. Let's hear from Sister Sterling first, then Brother Brian and Brother Charles.
Yes, Paul. I don't know if I missed it, but what I'm asking, or you could tell me if I missed what I'm asking, we've already mentioned. You mentioned that with Moses, things were happening in 40-year span, like? Good. I was just wondering if that was a type of a conditioning phase for Moses, for his wilderness trip, taking the Israelites on their way to the promised land. If that was the experiences 40 years, was a type of conditioning him for that trip.
I think that it was mentioned. The truth is, it taught him. Even Sister Pemberton on YouTube mentioned as well. It would have been used as conditioning. But he may not even have realized it was happening. But the truth is that, as somebody rightfully said, 40 years with sheep, 40 years raising children, 40 years being a husband, may have taught him, and being a son-in-law, may have taught him all he needs to know to lead people like she through two large spaces of dry land. It would taught him how to live off the land, if you believe it or not. It taught him how to live in the desert, how to survive in the desert, how to move, and you know. But it also would have taught him how to deal with issues and problems that arise. Because one thing that somebody pointed out that was interesting in anything is that Jethro, like the Jethro's daughters were being maligned by the other shepherds, and it seemed like how Jethro responded to it was like that was like a commonplace thing. Yeah, your daughter go down to the well, and yes, they'll be mistreated by shepherds. That's just what's happening all the time, like what's happening in Gideon's time. But he's the entrance now of Moses and saying, "No, that can't work here." If we don't even know what that life was like with Moses, even how he faced other shepherds, how he led that reality, how he changed. We don't know that history, but all that would have come into play. We see examples of his leading, examples of his being a savior to people. We see examples of a lot of different things coming out in his later years. So I would love to see the story, but when we get to heaven, to hear the story of those 40 years and what he would have gone through. But I believe strongly, like I said, I think also by Ellen White, that those years were conditioning years. Even if you did not realize it at the time, even if he was, as Alfred was saying, was just sending down to raise his children and live the life that all husbands and all fathers do, you know, coming to a place of retirement and what's not, and looking forward to your twilight years. He basically, God was building, whether he raised or not, God was creating something in him that was necessary. Because I don't know if, as Brother Jordan mentioned beforehand, if there's any other person at that time that have led those people like Moses did. It came after. I believe that Moses would have been the example for people like Joshua and so forth afterwards, for sure. But God raised Moses at this time for a very specific reason. And those 40-year periods, I don't know why God did it like that, but the truth is it was supposed to be so, and it was so. And God made the best of those 40 years, and so did Moses. That's all I could say. That's my personal answer. Brother Brian, let's hear from you, then Elder Charles.
Yes. Sister White made the point that while Moses was in Egypt, he guarded his affection. Now, if you go and get a family in Egypt now, he would be in a little conflict. His wife, his children, if he did decide to do that then. But she made the point that he guarded his affection even from his foster mother, that he would not cling to her so much that when time for doing what he was supposed to do, he would not hold as a, all right, this is my mother, I got to take care of her and so forth. It wouldn't be like that. It's important for us also to remember that we live in the world, but we are not to be of the world. And we have to guard our affections too, also from the places where we may work, the friends that we entertain. All these are important lessons that this life of Moses can point out to us in our time. And another important thing is this. Sister White says, in slaying the Egyptian, Moses had fallen into the same error so often committed by his fathers, of taking into their own hands the work that God had promised to do. It was not God's will to deliver his people by warfare, as Moses taught, but by his own mighty power, that the glory might be ascribed to him alone. Yet, even this rash act was overruled by God to accomplish his purpose. Moses was not prepared for his great work as yet. He had yet to learn the same lessons of faith that Abraham and Jacob had been taught, not to rely upon human strength or wisdom, but upon the power of God for the fulfillment of his promises. In the school of self-denial and hardship, he was to learn patience, to temper his passions, right? Before he could govern wisely, he must be trained to obey. His own heart must be fully in harmony with God before he could teach the knowledge of his will to Israel. By his own experience, he must be prepared to exercise a fatherly care over all who need his help. And so it is with us. We got to remember that we are in a school too. So the habits that we have inculcated during the course of our journey up to adulthood that are not in accordance with the will of God, we too have to get rid of. And God uses certain situations and circumstances to get these out. Very few times we see them and we look at the situation as, well, nonchalant, you know, this ain't doing nothing. But if we give our heart into the will of God and let him rule us, let this mind be in you, which is also in Christ Jesus, then we also will have the same Moses experience. We may not lead a nation to freedom, but in our daily journey and our daily life, we can be inspirational to others because they will see Christ living through us. To you. You're mute still.
Thanks, Brian. Brother Clark, let's hear from you.
Well, I think whatever was said by Brian, I was going to make a similar point, if not the same point. But I will end by saying that because I don't want to make the same point, that when we look at the book of Hebrews chapter 11 that we're looking at this week, I just want to make the point that these persons acted by faith. And in Hebrews 11:39, it says to us that we too will have to live by faith. And those persons are examples for us, people like the same Moses, who are favorite Bible characters of many of us. They acted by faith, and the same God that was there with Moses is here with us today. And we too must live by faith. I don't want to go over the same information that the others would have done. So that is my bit. And I want to challenge all of us to read the chapter and read also Patriarchs and Prophets, so that next time we can have a deeper understanding and there are lots of reminders of the message that God had for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So as we close, as we close off our session this evening, I just want to leave. I want to build on something that Brother Clark brought up, because it basically found in the same Hebrews 11, especially on Moses. But before I go into that, I'll share this. The reality is, maybe apply this situation to our lives. Now, especially those of us who are over 30, over 40, over 50, we are raised in a culture that says that your best days happen in your 20s and your 30s. When you start to reach 40s, basically things start, you're moving towards retirement, and you have to have this and this and this in place to get to a certain point. I mean, it even says that in some of the cases, when you reach 60, by the time when you are finished your work and you're now on to a different phase in life. And there's some persons who are in the space of life that they are, probably because of actions that they would take in the past, they're basically where they are now is not necessarily where they wanted to be, where they thought they would be. It is not the ideal. It is not what they wanted. It's not what they started out with, the thought of. You understand what I'm trying to say? There are a lot of us who are at a stage in our life we're at right now. We may be okay, maybe stable, or we may be in a place where it's like, yes, I'm okay, but I'm not with who I want to be anymore, because person may have passed on. I'm not where I want to be because something may have happened in terms of, your life. And it can come to a point where it says, I don't know what the next step is. I don't know where to go. And the thing is, am I here because of my bad actions or my bad choices? And the reality is, and it can get very easy to become settled and so forth. But one thing that strikes me about Moses' situation is that when God found him in the burning bush, God did not find a man who had walked away from him. He found a man who had been running, yes, for 40 years, yes. He found a man who had settled, yes. He did not find a man who was not a Christian anymore, though. He found a man, basically, was able to appear and speak to a man who had a faith in him that had continued. That's what the book of Hebrews speaks towards Moses. He did not lose his faith, even in those 40 years. Even though he had there's so much on his back, he did not lose his faith. So basically, what I'm trying to say is this. Regardless of where you are right now, where you think you are right now, maybe the most ideal place, but you do not know what God is doing through you. Your situation could be as dire as Moses. You could have gone from a rough place and had traveled for 18 days or 18 months or 18 years to get where you had to become. You might become to a place where you may be, you've settled, but you're not necessarily comfortable. You may be a stranger in a foreign land, maybe in something like that. The reality is, it does not mean that God is through with you yet. what you're going through, no, once you place it in the hands of God, God can take it and make it into what he wants it and needs it to be. And we don't know, as Brian rightfully said, we may not lead a nation to God. We may just do, because look at what the Ukrainian president has to do right now, and he sort of where he is. This man, and I'll say this, the Ukrainian president was on Dancing with the Stars a couple of years back, as far as I remember. From that to this, a lot of people didn't take him very seriously. But look at where he is now, standing at the forefront saying, I will not move, I will stand here with my people. Coming from Dancing with the Stars, that's showing on NBC or ABC, whatever, to this, basically in a war that all the world is looking at. Who knows? We may just, if the world is working, we may just be called to lead a nation or to lead a thing. But even if you're just called to help one person or a group of people, the thing is, God is not through with you yet. And nothing, no circumstance, no reality that you may live in your life can determine that there's no more left for you to offer. And that's not to say you have to kind of kill yourself doing everything for everybody. But the point is that there's no point in your life that God cannot turn around. God cannot relive in. God cannot bless you and bring you through to have his full work in your life. So the question is, are you a Moses? In your life, are you a Moses? Where you are now, are you a Moses? And basically, again, regardless of how you got to the place you are now, God still has the power to do what he has to do in your life. So basically, the encouragement is to allow him to do it. And I'll close off by giving Hebrews 11, verses 24, and by faith, chat about Moses. It says, by faith, Moses, and Brian alluded to this, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as a greater value than the treasures of Egypt. This is Paul talking, I believe so, because he was looking ahead ahead to his reward. And it says in verse 27, something very interesting. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. This is the writer of Hebrews. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible, talking about God. He saw God. And so I want to share the same reality with all of us as we go forward in this life, wherever our path may lead us. Do not moving forward in fear by what have brought you here, but moving forward again as Moses did, persevering because we see he who is invisible. We understand that God has a plan for our life, and basically who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it in you. So I hope this study was a blessing to you. There's much more to go. I believe that we want to go on to some different topics in the future, but I hope that this study would have been a blessing to you, and that there was something that sparked, if that you were in that place like Moses, that something would indicate to you that God still has a place and a purpose for life, regardless of how old or what place we're in our lives. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your participation. Over to you, Brother Jordan.
Thank you so much, Brother Paul. I'm grateful for your participation this afternoon. But before we do close, I just want to share a brief quotation with us from the book Patriarchs and Prophets, page 255. It says, a man will gain power and efficiency as he accepts the responsibilities that God places upon him, and with his whole soul seeks to qualify himself to bear them aright. However humble his position or limited his ability, that man will attain true greatness who, trusting to divine strength, seeks to perform his work with fidelity. Had Moses relied upon his own strength and wisdom and eagerly accepted, the great charge, he would have evinced his entire unfitness for such a work. The fact that a man feels his weakness is at least some evidence that he realizes the magnitude of his work appointed to him, and that he will make God his counselor and his strength. I just thought I would end on that note. And I just want to say thank you so much to each and everyone who were part of this platform this afternoon. No doubt next week we will continue our discussion. I wish each and everyone a blessed good night, a good week, and we look forward to coming back, meeting together on Wednesday night coming. I want to ask Sister Margaret, if you're on the, no, sorry, Sister, that says Sister Marcel, Shara, to close us off in prayer this evening.
Father, I want to thank you for another opportunity where we could open your word and study. We pray that as we have looked at the life of Moses, that we could take some of these lessons and apply them to our lives. I pray that we will allow you to be our guide no matter what we are going through. We always focus on you. I ask that you will take us through this week safely. Help us to have a wonderful and productive week. For Christ's sake, amen.
Amen. Amen. Well, God bless.
Amen.
Have a good night, everybody. And see you on Wednesday night. Then we shall come back again, join prayer meeting. And we hope all shall be well with everybody. Good night.
Good night, all.
Good night.
Good night.
See you Tuesday morning. Bye.
Well, that's right.
Good
Tuesday
night.
morning.
All right.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Hi, Harry.
Hello, everyone.
Sharon.